The episode presents Starfleet's dream, breaking the Warp 10 barrier, instant travel, home in a moment, the perfect solution to Voyager's problem, and the transwarp drive works. Tom Paris reaches Warp 10, infinite velocity existing at every point in the universe simultaneously, but when he returns, he's not the same man. His DNA is rewriting itself. His body is becoming something unrecognizable. And then nothing. No follow-up research, no Federation inquiry, no mention of the breakthrough ever again. The dark secret behind Threshold isn't that the experiment failed, it's that it succeeded. And what it did to Tom Paris wasn't a malfunction. It was a feature Starfleet could never allow to exist. For a crew stranded 70,000 light-years from home, normal warp travel offered a bleak sentence. A 70-year voyage across unexplored space. Breaking the Warp 10 barrier was not an exercise in Starfleet hubris or territorial expansion. It was a desperate bid for survival. Lieutenant Tom Paris, the ship's disgraced helmsman looking for redemption, championed the transwarp project as the ultimate key to their isolation. He was the only pilot aboard with the flight hours and reflexes to navigate the unstable warp fields of their experimental shuttlecraft, the Cochrane. Captain Catherine Janeway weighed the calculated risks, including a documented 2% chance of bilateral brain hemorrhage for her pilot, before officially clearing the mission. From the captain's bridge, the order went out. "Bridge to shuttlecraft Cochrane. You're cleared for launch." Paris's response from the cockpit was brief and resolute. "Aye, Captain. See you at Warp 10. As the shuttle cleared the hangar bay and accelerated past Voyager's maximum velocity, the sensors monitored the progression. Warp 9.7, 9.8, 9.9, then 9.95. When Paris pushed the modified dilithium warp core to its absolute limit, the severe structural shaking of the vessel stopped. The console flashed. The test succeeded, and the Cochrane crossed the threshold. Paris returned alive, proving that the barrier could be broken. The immediate aftermath of the flight did not bring celebration. Instead of a triumphant pilot stepping out of the Cochrane, Voyager's crew recovered a man undergoing a sudden, terrifying physical collapse. The barrier had been broken, yet the historic achievement was instantly overshadowed by a profound human anomaly. Tom Paris had reached infinite velocity, but the person who returned was no longer entirely Tom Paris. What followed in the archival record is a glaring blank space. Historically, a breakthrough of this magnitude, collapsing interstellar distance to zero, should have redefined the Federation's entire scientific framework. Yet after the initial crisis resolved, the Warp 10 drive vanished from Voyager's active research logs. The ship's database showed no further development, no secondary test flights, and no theoretical follow-up. This sudden silence is not accompanied by an explicit, documented Starfleet suppression order, but the complete disappearance of the technology from the narrative speaks volumes. This raises a difficult question about the nature of Starfleet's operational doctrine. Why would a crew stranded 70,000 light-years from home permanently shelf a proven method of instant travel? The complete abandonment of Warp 10 suggests that the terrifying physical cost of the flight was not a temporary system malfunction or a calibration error in the Cochrane's modified core. Instead, it raises a far more unsettling possibility that the biological consequence was an inherent, inescapable feature of the Warp 10 process itself. To understand the physical reality of this achievement, we must examine the exact mechanics of the flight as recorded by Voyager's sensors. Within the Starfleet scientific framework, Warp 10 is defined not merely as an extreme speed, but as the absolute theoretical limit of space-time. It represents infinite velocity. To reach this threshold is to collapse the physical concept of distance, meaning a vessel occupies every single point in the universe simultaneously. The telemetry of the modified shuttlecraft Cochrane documents this transition with clinical precision. Tuvok monitored the long-range sensors as the shuttle exceeded Voyager's maximum velocity. On screen, the console tracked the velocity climbing steadily. Warp 9.7, 9.8, 9.9, and then 9.95. The physical stress on the shuttlecraft was immense, yet the systems did not fail. An important distinction must be made here between transwarp, the experimental propulsion method used to manipulate the warp field, and Warp 10, the actual velocity target itself. At the critical moment of transition, the sensors confirmed the breakthrough. The flight recorder captured the final technical telemetry, engine output at maximum, velocity, Warp 10. At that exact millisecond, the violent structural shaking of the cockpit stopped completely. The transwarp engine stabilized, and the nacelle pylons remained structurally intact. The Cochrane had not been torn apart by the spatial forces. It had successfully navigated the theoretical limit and returned safely to Voyager's shuttle bay. The physical data on the consoles was clear and objective. The Warp 10 barrier had been breached, and the ship's propulsion hardware survived the flight. The survival of the shuttle's engine shifted the crisis entirely from a mechanical failure to a biological catastrophe. When the emergency medical hologram scanned Tom Paris, the diagnostics did not reveal radiation poisoning or spatial anomalies, but a rapid, systematic rewriting of his genetic code. The EMH observed that the pilot's DNA was restructuring at an accelerated rate, matching 4 million years of natural evolutionary change in mere hours. This genetic rewriting forced immediate physical restructuring. Paris's internal organs began duplicating, including the development of a second heart, while his respiratory system rejected oxygen in favor of a nitrogen acidic chloride compound. This metamorphosis was not a sickness caused by outer space radiation or environmental contamination. It was a direct consequence of the speed itself. Exceeding the threshold of infinite velocity had initiated a rapid transition into a salamander-like amphibian form. The narrative frames this physical change not as a simple regression, but as accelerated human evolution. This raises the unsettling possibility that the resulting state represents a form of advanced existence rather than mere degradation, leaving the true nature of his consciousness unresolved. The crisis expanded when Paris kidnapped Captain Catherine Janeway and subjected her to the same infinite velocity. Janeway underwent an identical metamorphosis, leaving both officers stranded on a swamp world in their altered physical forms. Their brief time on the planet resulted in the production of 3 amphibian offspring, which the crew ultimately left behind in their new natural environment. To reverse the mutation, the EMH developed a treatment using highly focused antiproton radiation. Short bursts of this radiation successfully destroyed the mutant DNA, allowing the original human genetic templates of both Janeway and Paris to reassert control and fully restore their human biology. Yet with the crew restored and the mechanics of the drive proven, the transwarp project was permanently abandoned. The Cochrane was parked, the modified dilithium core was ignored, and the capability of instant travel across the quadrant was never tested again. This abrupt decision to shelf a functional technology, without any recorded debate, suggests an unwritten priority within Starfleet's operational doctrine. Some breakthroughs are simply too dangerous to keep. At infinite velocity, the very geometry of interstellar space collapses. Mathematically, a propulsion system that places a vessel in every corner of the universe simultaneously redefines the basic principles of security and survival. In a peaceful quadrant, the constructive uses of infinite range are obvious. Rescue operations could reach dying worlds in a heartbeat. Emergency medical teams could transport specialized vaccines across thousands of light years in an instant. Planetary disasters could be met with immediate coordinated relief, while communication lag between remote outposts would cease to exist. Yet these same capabilities present devastating military consequences. When distance is removed as a barrier, defensive perimeters lose their meaning. A starship equipped with a functional Warp 10 drive does not need to bypass a planetary defense grid. It simply occupies the space inside it. The Romulan neutral zone, or the Klingon border, would fail to offer even basic protection. This reality collapses conventional deterrence. Tactical maneuvers, defensive patrols, and strategic retreats rely entirely on the transit time of an adversary. If transit time becomes 0, surprise attacks are absolute, and defense becomes impossible. Unstoppable pursuit and instant strike capability would become the baseline of space warfare. Should rival empires such as the Cardassians or the Romulans acquire this technology, a destabilizing arms race would follow immediately. Survival would force every major power to develop first-strike transwarp capabilities. While official records do not contain a formal Starfleet policy declaring infinite range a threat to galactic stability, the tactical math points to absolute dominance. The danger of the Cochrane's flight extended beyond the biological mutation of the pilot. It threatened the entire balance of galactic power. The historical record contains no scene where Starfleet Command convenes an emergency session, issues a classified directive, or formally drafts a ban on infinite velocity. No strategic council debates the tactical threat of the modified shuttlecraft, and no investigator arrives to seize Voyager's databases. Instead, the entire theory of an institutional cover-up rests on a glaring absence. Voyager simply stops trying. This complete cessation of Warp 10 development occurs without a single line of dialogue justifying the decision. When the ship later seeks a path home, the crew completely ignores the working propulsion drive sitting in their own hangar deck. They spend years instead pursuing high-risk, unstable alternatives, from stealing Borg transwarp coils to experimenting with volatile quantum slipstream drives that threaten to tear the hull apart. This consistent shift in behavior remains the only real evidence of a policy change, suggesting an unwritten consensus. The technology was not merely paused, but permanently buried. The underlying question is not whether the drive worked, but whether any organized galactic power can tolerate a universe where distance ceases to exist. If a single modified shuttlecraft can bypass every defensive perimeter in the quadrant, then absolute vulnerability becomes the baseline. In a galaxy where every rival faction would inevitably demand the same unchallengeable reach, the only way to preserve the galactic balance of power is to ensure that the technology remains a theoretical impossibility. If everyone cannot have it, then nobody can. The physical transformation of Tom Paris and Catherine Janeway presents an interpretive problem that Starfleet's medical logs never fully resolve. When the emergency medical hologram observes a genetic shift corresponding to 4 million years of evolutionary change, the computer relies on a strictly linear vocabulary. But what does 4 million years of human development actually look like? To a Federation built on humanoid identity, the resulting amphibian form appears to be a grotesque regression, a disease to be cured, an error to be corrected. Yet this perspective assumes that survival must always mean retaining the human shape. If Paris truly existed at every point in the universe simultaneously, his biology may not have collapsed. It may have adapted to an environment where the traditional human limits no longer apply. This raises the troubling question of consciousness. During the transition, Paris struggles to maintain his grip on language, memory, and agency, slipping into instinct. But does this loss of human identity signal the death of the mind, or is it the birth of a consciousness that no longer needs words to comprehend the cosmos? The archival records leave this choice completely open. We are left with a series of competing diagnoses. Is this state a degenerative disease, a forced adaptation, an animal regression, a new branch of life, or a genuine biological transcendence? If the mutated form represents an evolutionary leap, then Starfleet's swift decision to force both officers back into their human templates looks less like a medical rescue, and more like an institutional refusal to let humanity change. If a Starfleet officer undergoes an evolutionary leap that completely alters their human biology, their status within the Federation's legal and social framework immediately fractures. The United Federation of Planets is built on the preservation of humanoid rights, individual dignity, and structured rank. But a post-human entity existing outside these biological parameters raises questions that Starfleet's charter is entirely unequipped to handle. Does a mutated crew member retain their Starfleet rank, their legal rights, or their citizenship? Does a being that has evolved past the need for technology or physical limits still belong to the Federation, or does it become something else entirely, a sovereign entity, or perhaps a threat to be contained? Starfleet's immediate deployment of anti-proton therapy reveals an institutional preference for the known biological template over theoretical progress. While the Federation officially champions scientific advancement, this treatment suggests an unwritten limit. Progress is acceptable only as long as humanity remains recognizably human. By restoring Janeway and Paris to their original genetic states, the crew bypassed an existential crisis of identity. Had the breakthrough been made public, explaining a technology that changes human pioneers into a completely new species might have triggered widespread panic across the Federation. This suggests that Starfleet chose to abandon the Warp 10 project not because the engines failed, but because they could not publicly reconcile the biological cost. By permanently burying the research, they avoided answering whether humanity is ready to leave its current form behind. This raises the unsettling possibility that the story of Warp 10 serves as a deliberate warning, a narrative constructed to make viewers recoil at the prospect of physical transcendence, prompting us to ask what the creators of this universe truly wanted us to fear. The widespread reputation of this hour as one of the weakest entries in the Voyager library is well documented. Audiences and critics alike quickly dismissed the story, objecting to its questionable physics, the bizarre rapid mutations, and the awkward reproductive storyline that the writers so quickly resolved and swept under the rug. Over the years, writer Brandon Braga has echoed these sentiments, openly describing the episode as a creative misfire. In a standard production context, these statements are simply expressions of professional regret rather than a confession of some hidden intent. But looking at the narrative from a meta-analytical perspective, the overwhelming negative reaction to the episode achieves the exact outcome an anxious Starfleet would desire. By presenting the ultimate barrier of propulsion as a source of physical horror and biological degradation, the story conditions the audience to reject the capability entirely. This grotesque framing ensures that the concept of infinite velocity is associated with the loss of human identity rather than infinite scientific potential. Under the speculative meta-reading, the episode functions as a successful piece of Federation propaganda, teaching the viewer to fear the very idea of transcendent evolution and to support the abandonment of the drive. It is important to emphasize that this remains a provocative meta-reading, and an interpretation of the text rather than an established canonical fact. Yet the narrative itself leaves behind a striking piece of unresolved residue that keeps this line of questioning alive. The crew never mentions the 3 hybrid offspring left behind on that swamp planet again, leaving them as a quiet, unexplained consequence of humanity's brief brush with the infinite. By leaving their existence completely unaddressed in later logs, the narrative preserves a lingering sense of a truth still hidden. Was Starfleet right to forbid Warp 10, or did the episode teach us to accept that fear, and what would you have done in Janeway's place? Subscribe to Trek Vault for more analysis of what Star Trek episodes reveal about the Federation's real agenda. The telemetry of the Cochrane remains the solid foundation of this mystery. The flight recorder confirms that Warp 10 is not a theoretical fantasy. The transwarp engine stabilized, the nacelle pylons held, and the shuttle returned. This is the first level of proof. The technology functions and infinite velocity is achievable. The second level of evidence lies in the absolute silence that followed. Voyager's decision to park the working shuttle and spend years seeking high-risk alternatives such as Borg transwarp coils or volatile quantum slipstream drives reveals a deliberate choice. The propulsion system was not abandoned because it failed, but because it succeeded too completely. The complete cessation of the research program occurred without a single line of debate, indicating an unwritten consensus that the technology had to be buried. This silent abandonment suggests a strategic calculation. If distance is reduced to 0, defensive perimeters, neutral zones, and tactical maneuvering lose all meaning. Absolute vulnerability becomes the baseline of the quadrant, destabilizing the balance of power. But the true threat of Warp 10 is not merely tactical, it is existential, challenging the very definition of humanoid identity. This is where the direct evidence of the episode aligns with the theory of institutional suppression. By framing the physical transformation of Tom Paris and Catherine Janeway as a grotesque mutation, the narrative conditions us to accept the containment of infinite speed. The true nature of their altered state remains unresolved. Starfleet's medical files treat the change as a sickness to be cured, but it could easily represent a form of biological adaptation, a state of existence where traditional human limits no longer apply. The deployment of antiproton therapy was not just a medical rescue, it was an institutional refusal to let humanity change. In this light, Paris and Janeway represent the human cost of a breakthrough that Starfleet was entirely unequipped to govern. Starfleet itself remains the quiet, absent authority, enforcing its doctrine through the systematic burial of scientific data. By letting the event be dismissed as a tragic, isolated mistake, the Federation preserves its borders, its humanoid structure, and its authority. The grotesque framing of the flight protects the status quo, transforming a gateway to the infinite into a forbidden zone. If Starfleet had presented Warp 10 as an opportunity rather than a horror, would the Federation have embraced it, or forbidden it anyway? What other Star Trek episodes contain Starfleet doctrines hiding in plain sight? Ultimately, the barrier of Warp 10 is not a limitation of physics, but a boundary of human identity. By keeping this breakthrough buried, Starfleet ensured its crews remain safely within their current evolutionary tier. But as the galaxy grows more volatile, we must wonder, is freezing our own evolution the price we pay to stay human, or is Starfleet merely delaying an inevitable leap?